So when we look through the lens of syntropy at the differences between men and women, uh, it's I've become a very syntropic human being, so to speak, because I've re-enabled so much of my original nature by undoing the stories and rescripting them, and also releasing the psycho-emotional intensity associated to narratives that I would always revisit, so to speak, or they would reoccur. So the patterns in life always repeat themselves and exacerbate themselves until the self, the wholeness of self, is willing to check in with, do I want to keep doing it like this? And with that, I feel that being in the trinity of syntropy, and now no longer primarily in the triangle of trauma, I've turned a lot of my trauma, so to speak, into treasures, and they are now beautiful qualities and strengths that are actually just part of human nature. They're part of being loving, kind, caring. And how that can be best seen is that I'm less reactive, I'm more responsive, but I have so much more peacefulness to my neurochemistry when I experience things that are unpredictable. And that's because there is no longer neurochemical associative memory happening, as in neurochemical reactions that used to be based so much on control or fear or frequencies of shame, frequencies of guilt, that were all part of programming that I grew up with in the Western cult. And growing up in the place called the Netherlands is no different than growing up in the place called America. There may be some distinctions, some differences, some slight nuances that would be just creating a bit more of a diversity, so to speak, in terms of biodiversification of cult programming. That is just different gradations and different shades of gray, so to speak. But they're certainly not the color of the rainbow. And I mean the Steiner pastel type of rainbow, not this silly identity-based rainbow flag that humans have been touting around for quite some time. That all just screams of a deep sense of not feeling that they belong. First of all, not in the culture, and then second of all, not to love, and then third, not to God, and then with that, not to nature. And that is that foundational rusak, the brokenness of not having been raised in a generational dynamic where the premise and the foundation of nature is really embedded into the upbringing. And so children aren't really raised, they're being brought down in this day and age, and have been brought down for well over 150, 180 years. But cult programming, of course, is part of every culture, because every culture programs the next generation according to the beliefs and the ideologies and the fantasies that they have about how life works on the earth. And I found a lot of my answers in indigenous wisdom keepers' works and their writings, and also through studying directly with indigenous grandmothers and listening closely to the words between the words with elders of different indigenous tribes in Australia, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also the more primal, so to speak, cultures in the Pacific Ocean. And now, of course, I'm deeply integrated in this beautiful land called Bali with a Balinese family, and really feel so at home in the rich indigeneity and the purity of heart, and also the naivete, because they don't understand anything that is really of the Western world. They just think that MSG tastes great. They have no comprehension around any of the imported, brought in, industrialized apparatuses that have been coming into this place, how that could possibly have a corrosive or even a detrimental effect over the long term on their health. And their naivete is beautiful. And in this milieu where I am living, I get to really see from the outside even more inward on and onto the Western mind, how it thinks and how it operates. And when we look at the differences between men and women from a place of syntropy, it is very beneficial to recognize the context and the container and the milieu that the conversations about differences of between men and women are really verbalized. And that's because if we are looking at Western cult programming from a syntropic lens, we get to see how unnatural it is operating. And so when we then say that men are very singularly focused and men are operating in these, that is all very true, but it's very true in the context of the Western culture, the Western programming, the Western conditioning. And that conditioning is old. And of course, there are neurological, biological, neurochemical, and biochemical differences in terms of the hormones that drive and run through the bloodstream of a she are very different than the ones that are driving through the bloodstream of a he. And so there are very beautiful differences that are all there, designed, as I see it, to really complement one and each other. And I feel that as I reflect on how I am as a man, as a he in this life, in this body, that to some of the articulated nuances and clear-cut differences between men and women, I can very much relate because I come from that place, the Western world. And being in a more re-enabled, again in my nature place within myself, I can see that a lot of it doesn't necessarily feel like it applies to me. I'm so much more in flow, and with that, I'm probably more harmonizing my feminine side and alchemizing that feminine and masculine within, which is from my comprehension of most of the mystery schools of the Rose lineage, the Magdalene line, and back to the temples of Egypt in the right and the left eye of Horus traditions. I have, over the years during my time in spiritual pursuit lands, where my soul was shining me into directions of reconnecting with that ancient wisdom and discovering the depth and the relevancy of her story, because everybody in the Western cult only grows up with his story. And so to really, for me, it was beautiful to have a a preset orientation that made me not want to lean into that and masculine world, that the world of men. I've always felt more attracted, and with that I was also avoiding some of my trauma because some of it was still too, let's say, raw and too hurt, because in the Western cult, every human being that gets born into that, and it's not a lotus birth and is not raised with a matriarchal presence and a patriarchal presence that is seeing them, acknowledging them, honoring their sovereignty, seeing their soul, and taking the responsibility to really provide and protect with love and kindness, and no reprimanding and no shaming and rejecting and guilting and all of the hand-me-downs traumas that people get from the generation that was their so-called parents. When younglings are truly raised and allowed to flourish in their nature, when we take it into the space of Waldorf education that aids so many humans so much. But the predominant culture around everybody in the Western world is still operating so much on entropic, almost dystopian and fully untrue belief systems that are so unexamined. And that's really what this is all about, is to really start questioning in around the unexamined assumptions that we have about reality, that therefore is true, and it's just a bunch of made up beliefs, that when we take it into the space of syntropy, that we then really can discover that there's a contrast that emerges, because the way that the humans are navigating either in their thoughts or their actions isn't natural and isn't operating on what in syntropic agroforestry is called the strategy of unconditional love and collaboration and contribution, with a metric woven in kindness and receptivity and reciprocity. And with that, really, as grown-ups comprehending our function and role as emissaries, and that we get to emulate for the younglings. We get to live in a living life way in front of them. We get to forelive the syntropic life ways that are true to our human nature, but therefore they are peaceful and they are kind and they are playful and they are continuously engaged in the curious and in the realm of the awe, so that the exploration of the divinity that is enshrined in all of creation, that really becomes a field of study, a field of exploring, a field of relating with, and a field of questioning, always more questions around. And of course, a lot of us have been grown up that when we ask too many questions, we would get shut down. We would be too. It baffles me with where I sit now. We were too curious. Like, we are souls coming to the earth. We come in like empty sheets, but are binding on of the pages of our book from that sits between the two bookends of birth and death. The bindings are there, our blueprint is there, but what gets scripted onto the belief system manual is overriding the intrinsic and the innate and the natural inborn orientations that every newborn baby comes into this world with. And that orientation is that new souls coming into embodied form as humans on this earth have an innate anticipation for love. And yet, of course, the parents do, to the best of their capacity, the loving and the caring and the nurturing. But because of the cult programming and all the pre-existing trauma, there is so much being handed over and down. And until we actually really make an assessment of the gravity that the continual promulgation of human damage really causes, until we really get to terms with that, and until we really are willing to look at that, firstly outside of ourselves, because that's a lot easier, but then as master navigators in training, we actually start, through our activation of our will, we start the willingness process to continuously be willing to show up, to see where we are actually harboring belief systems, ideologies, norm-based value systems that are all made up structures so that we can operate and conduct ourselves in a particular manner, fairly entropic, based on control, fear, lack, scarcity, whatever we want to call it. There's a huge demographic, and we've been programmed to operate like that, because when we stand in the truth of syntropy, in that beautiful triangle of self-sovereignty, self-love, and syntropy, when we stand in that truth of awareness, we can very clearly see that we have been programmed in a in a way that has been about a small group of humans feeling the need somehow, and I thank them for it, because it's raised so much awareness, and it's all performing a function with purpose, and there is no right or wrong truly in the universe. There is just everything performing a function with purpose. And so those, they call them elite, but I call them just degraded people, the parasites, that the kleptoparasitic people on this earth have very intentionally instilled programming that made it so that what got written in the on the pages of the next generation were belief systems that are not standing in the truth, and have no standing in the triangle of syntropy, because they degrade sovereignty, they exclude love, and with that abundance, because they operate on scarcity and subservience, and they are not syntropic, because they're not about collaboration and contribution. They're about extraction, and they're about control and domination. And those narratives are very relevant to understand in our human ecology, because when we see human ecology through the lens of syntropy, we can really clearly see that our world today, in broad strokes, is not operating in its original, in the original covenant that our soul actually has with creator. And that is beautiful. That is also painful, because it's a lot to grok, it's a lot to be with. And yet the true gift in that, how we turn trauma into treasures, is to recognize where we are still controlling, where we are still wanting to dominate, where we are still afraid, where we still operate on patterns of guilt. And we go and navigate inward to find those patterns, those places within ourselves where those stories in ourselves are living, are stored, where then patterns of recreating those stories keep showing up in our life as we navigate through this beautiful, wonderful world. And we keep wondering why. Well, the answer to why is human damage. And the answer to why with human damage is on the internal landscape. And so the differences between men and women are very beautiful. And they are there to complement each other. And of course, comprehending the context and the culture that a man or a woman has up in will define very much so their mental pre-programmed orientations. Does that therefore also say that that is who men are? When we look through the lens of syntropy, we can say, well, actually, they're operating on a de-appreciated, pre-programmed, almost diminished capacity of their full kingship. And this is why writings about creating the kingdom, and also for the woman to really embody her queen self. We cannot become kings and queens in the archetype of it to the fullest extent of what that really means. And we're not talking about traditional cult programmed kings and queens, but the true inheritance that comes with embodying the frequency of a queen. She has to operate on a frequency of love and honor, and seeing, in this case, in the relationship field, her man as the king, and she celebrates him and she honors and reveres him, and she is in awe of his skills and capacities, which will only bring out more of his greatness. And equally for a man endeavoring to embody his full kingship, it would make sense for him to really come to comprehend the syntropic nature of the she. And this would be a conversation that we can have at another time, where we go and explore, well, what does the queendom of the syntropic she really look like, because that's speaking about her in her full nature. And fortunately, so many women have already endeavored to speak to the depth and the expanse that lies in that beautiful queendom, that beautiful domain. It involves birth, it involves nursing, it involves being a sister, being an auntie, being a grandmother, being a mother, being a daughter. It has such a broad scope. And to me, it seems that the best place that anybody that wants to endeavor to explore that more, particularly men, to engage with her story, the untold story between two of the most significant people that have probably walked the earth. Because, as Zach Bush so beautifully said it in a recent podcast, is that 2,000 years later, whether we believe it to be true or not true, whether we believe there's merit in those stories or not, we are still talking about them. And so was that therefore a a a shaping event between two people, whether we believe they never existed or not, it is still to this day one of the most potent love stories between man and woman that that offers both sexes so much what was withheld, so much of the story that wasn't told. And without that missing link, which I call syntropy being the missing link, we would have a challenging it's like an impairment to really being able to re-enable our nature without syntropy as the lens, because we would not have the predetermined willingness to be curious and question not only our own belief systems and our programs as a man or as a woman, but predominantly the projections that we would have on the opposite sex, and the belief systems that, oh, men are like this, women are like that. It's very easy, it seems to me, for women to shelter themselves more, and it's part of a rekindling and a remembering and a reactivating of their feminine true nature to do that in sisterhood. But a lot of that still comes from the pain and the oppressing cult that they grew up in, that had so many patriarchal figures and narratives berating down on them. And yet within that lies the beautiful opportunity to turn that trauma into treasures, because only then can the honoring and the full seeing of through her eyes be placed upon his beingness. And until she has become free of the stories that inhibit her own freedom, she will not be able to freely be able to love him, and vice versa. This goes both ways. And where this work can only truly be done is to resolve the stories internally around the primary he and all the programming of the different primary he's and all the traumatization that happened from the exposure to unnatural ways that primary he's have navigated in a she's life, and equally for men. And it's on both parts and it's on both sides. And that's where an internal alchemization and harmonization that isn't so much about healing our imprints around the mother and healing our imprints around the father, that all creates more freedom when we stay close to the field of syntropy, and in an open curiosity we remain willing to come into awareness what else wants to be renewed, restored, relinquished, let go of, recoded, rescripted. We will find that we become more of a loving human being, that in noun terms, in terms of nouns, we would become more androgynous. Not in a physiological way, but we just become more gentle, caring, and also clear. Men become more protective, but not out of fear or out of need, but out of purpose, because it is intrinsic to a man to operate from a place of purposeful protecting. And he does that primarily through presence, simply through him being, which then regulates her nervous system because she feels safe. So she gets to unfurl and unwind. And so there's so many beautiful complementary qualities that are naturally part of the differences in sexes in our human ecology. It is, however, very relevant that when we ask questions about the differences of men and women, and when I'm being asked, were you able to relate to everything that this woman shared about what women don't know that men don't know about women, or that men don't know about themselves, about what they don't know about women? It was such a beautiful narrative, and I found it so inspiring. And I take it through my syntropic field orientation, and I see that, yeah, in the context of the Western world, I find a lot of resonance because I can relate to all of that. When I place that fully in the sphere of syntropy, I would have to say we got to get real with cult programming, because a lot of the things that are being spoken about are all coming out of the context of a dysfunctional, patriarchally programmed, fully traumatized, and really orchestrated programming that was set up in such a way that humans predominantly operate in the Western world with belief systems that are based on very, very, very limiting narratives. And they pass those on, and they culture and program the next generation. And it's very important to speak to that so we can see and look at that from the distance that syntropy graces us with. It's truly a gracing that we get to have a meta perspective, take ourselves out of the density of all the rah of the programming, and see through a lens of love and also objectivity, because that's what syntropy provides. That Western world is not operating in the broad strokes in a syntropic orientation. It's not operating from a place of love. And over time, it may get there, as the hunger and the starvation for love is only, through time, seems to have only increased. And yet human nature for both parents, father, mother, despite the programming, is that they are also hardwired for love. So is the newborn coming into the family. It's connectivity and connection, that we are interconnected with each other, that is a piece of her story that hasn't been told and has been suppressed, and it benefits bringing that forward. And I really feel that without then jumping to the other camp and fully only wanting to be in her story land, syntropy merges and alchemizes both narratives through a very, I would say, indigenous and beautifully harmonic lens, where also the intrinsic naivete of us as human beings can be a place where we can find solace again, where we can find freedom to be in that place again. And how beautiful it is that we can do that together by sharing the narrative, sharing the language of syntropy, sharing the transference of how we, in our human nature, are actually truly wed to a field of loving kindness. And that allows us then to connect more expansively with ourselves, with the natural world around us, and with our beautiful fellow human beings around us, from a place of peaceful sovereignty and love.